now, and my name's Matt Thomas, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to the Newcastle Institute April webinar. Newcastle has been a place of sharing ideas and learning for thousands of years. We're proud to continue that tradition in this virtual space tonight. We pay our respects to the original custodians of this land, the Wabakal and Worimi peoples, to elders past and present, and we thank all people who have made Newcastle a place where we can continue to explore and discover new ways of thinking, doing and being. Newcastle Institute was formed in 2004 to promote rational discussion of diverse ideas, ideas that impact on all of us as we live in our communities. Now more than ever, we need these opportunities. So tonight we'll be exploring the potential for a new society in Australia following the COVID-19 epidemic in the context of current challenges. This was actually voted the #1 topic in our recent member survey. Joining us to provide their perspectives tonight are Father Rod Bauer, Professor Roberta Ryan and Brad Webb. I'll just briefly introduce each of the panellists. The Venerable Rod Bauer is an Anglican priest, rector of Gosford, where he has served for 19 years, and Archdeacon for Justice Ministries and the chaplaincy in the Diocese of Newcastle. I'm glad I practiced that sentence. He is an ambassador to the Refugee Council of Australia and serves on the board of the Samaritans Foundation. Father Rod is a passionate advocate for a number of social justice and human rights issues, including marriage equality. He believes that our treatment of asylum seekers, the lack of action on climate change, and the failure to adequately recognise First Nations peoples damages our communal soul. Father Rod is married to Kerry, also a passionate advocate for asylum seekers, and they are married with 2 children and 4 grandchildren. He received the 2016 Doha International Award for Interfaith Dialogue and was named Abyssinian of the Year by the Muslim community. He's the author of Outspoken. Roberta was recently appointed as professor at the University of Newcastle, and is a political sociologist with a strong interest in the relationship between people and places. Her work considers spatial inequity and mechanisms to enhance citizen engagement in decisions that affect them through tools such as citizen juries and policy interventions, which enhance citizen and expert input into the decision making, particularly at a local level. And finally, Brad Webb is originally from Guyra in northern New South Wales, but moved to the Hunter in 2004 and instantly fell in love with the region and its communities. Notably, his 11 years in leadership roles at the Hunter Medical Research Institute, HMRI, saw him work across the community and witness the power of collective impact. Brad's work as the CEO of Samaritans sees him following in his passion for ensuring that all members of the community, particularly those excluded or marginalised, are given an opportunity to live fulfilling lives. This means not only supporting direct service delivery, but also promoting public debate about social justice and how to change the structures that drive disadvantage. As part of this broader advocacy network, Brad sits on the boards of the New South Wales Council of Social Services, NCOS, and the Committee for the Hunter. So thank you to all the panellists tonight. I'll just kick off, outline some housekeeping matters, and then we'll start our discussion. For those attending via Zoom, you're welcome to use the Q&A function, which should be at the bottom of your screen, the Q&A button, and that'll enable you to post a question to the panel. For those watching on Facebook, please post a comment on the live stream, and that'll be transferred to us to the panel to address. We may not get to all the questions, but we'll try and cover as many as we can. And after a general discussion amongst the panel, we'll start questions at about 7:30. This is only our second webinar, and we're certainly getting more familiar with the technology, so we still may have some technical glitches. I'm particularly concerned that the NBN around this time of the evening, often probably once every 3 days, tends to fail for me. But if that happens, we will reconnect in a different address, so please just try and log back on in a few minutes if you lose this stream. One last thing I might just add, if you're seeing a box on the screen with your own name in it, you're probably in gallery view, so hit speaker view at the top of your screen if you're using Zoom, this is. And you can also press turn off non-video participants by hitting the 3 dots next to that box. Hopefully it hasn't happened, but if it has, that's what you do just to make sure you only see the panelists. Having covered the housekeeping, I will pass across to Rod Bauer to make some opening comments.
Well, thank you, Matt. And I'd like to acknowledge that down here in the Central Coast, I have the great privilege of living in the land of the Darkined young people, and I honour elders past, present and emerging. Well, when I first thought about training for the priesthood over 30 years ago, I realised that having left school at 15, I actually needed to find a way to gain university entrance. Back in those days, this meant doing an open foundation course at Newcastle University. It was there that I chose two subjects, philosophy and political economics. Now, I can remember very little of those courses or anything that I learnt in them, but I must have learned enough of their essence that when I eventually entered the seminary, I began to recognise that I was actually not only studying theology, but I was also studying the teachings of a first century Jewish political economist. So before I say what I wanted to say briefly, I first want to acknowledge the pain and suffering now afflicting so many people, especially the physically, economically, culturally and politically vulnerable. I recognise that the fact that I can even talk about these things in this context means that I'm coming from a particularly privileged perspective, and therefore acknowledge that I've got an even greater responsibility to engage meaningfully in a political future that we have together. Most of the economic theory that has sort of inspired and driven me for these 30 years was enshrined in story, as rabbis usually do. Stories mostly about householders, literally in Greek, oikodespotos, which we get our word economist from. It means ruler of the house. Stories were told about debt and payment, about farmers who couldn't pay their rent, about stewards who mismanaged the landholders' money. These stories are all economic, political, philosophical in nature, and we do well to engage in their essence. This economic and political philosophy eventually began to be known as the Way. Now, this way has been lived out by small groups throughout the centuries, but it has never ever been taken seriously enough to actually be lived out in reality by the general populace. But perhaps now we are beginning to ask those questions. As people begin to acknowledge that we do indeed need to find a new way, because simply the old way has ceased to work, we can all talk about perhaps an economy of compassion. Now, this doesn't mean that we completely abandon capitalism, but it does mean that we radically change what we actually capitalise. Now, we could have kept the old economy simply by sacrificing millions of mostly vulnerable lives, embracing what Rupert Murdoch called the only truly moral thing, the free market. Or we could do as we have done. The reality is that many young people with their future ahead of them are now being asked to pay what appears, from the perspective of the old way, a significant price for the lives of the vulnerable, particularly the aged. Now, I don't want to step back from naming this perceived reality, but rather I want to lean into it, because we have in this moment chosen perhaps a new way. We've chosen perhaps to be more fully human. However, if we choose this new way and remain committed to the course, the price we are paying now will not be seen as a burdensome debt to hang over the heads of generations to come, but rather an investment in the future that in hindsight we will come to understand as wise and prudent. This time of suffering has brought many trials for so many people, but unless we engage with the opportunity this time also brings, the suffering will be deepened and perpetuated. In fact, we must use this time to prepare for the economic, political and cultural necessities of living productively with global heating. In the meantime, however, we have to acknowledge that COVID-19 came into a reasonably buoyant, if now clearly not so robust, economic framework. COVID-21 or 22 or perhaps 25 will attack an already weakened global economy unless we begin to change the paradigm altogether, embracing the reality that this new way will have predominantly ecological architecture. In a book entitled Paradise Built in Hell, Rebecca Solnit argues, disasters are opportunities as well as oppressions. Each one a summons to rediscover the powerful engagement and joy of genuine altruism, civic life, grassroots community, and meaningful work. She says, if paradise now arises in hell, it's because in the suspension of the usual order and the failure of most systems, we are free to live and to act another way.
Thank you, Rod. Certainly is redefining vulnerability, I think, for many of us. We all step much closer to that edge. Roberta, can I ask you to also make some opening comments, please?
Yeah, thanks very much. Thanks, Matt, and hello to the other panelists and to the audience. I'm very pleased to be here, and it's a great way to start, I hope, what continues to be an important conversation. I'm really interested in inequality, as the introduction Matt gave you would have indicated, and of course things like pandemics and viruses hit the most vulnerable in a variety of ways, and we've seen the nature of inequality in Australia really changing. It never stays the same. We've seen a pattern since World War II where those people who are most disadvantaged were older Australians, and particularly older Australians that were in the private rental market. Going through to the 1960s, we've seen the changing nature of inequality and structural disadvantage, particularly affecting women who weren't in the labour market, women who didn't have good education. And of that group, single mothers were the most vulnerable and disadvantaged in that period. And the more children they had, the more disadvantaged they were. Right through to today, where this pattern of disadvantage is really something that we see play out, what I call spatially. In other words, one of the key determinants of your life chances, both positive and negative, are reflected in your postcode. So when we see the impact of a pandemic like we're confronting today, it's going to play out differently for different groups of people. And I think the way that unemployment particularly is affecting people, and we look at the way that employment numbers are playing out in the Hunter at the moment, of the 5 top employment categories and the areas that are being most dramatically affected by unemployment in the 3rd, 4th and 5th categories are people who are working in hospitality, retail and the arts. And of course those people are suddenly, rather dramatically, without an income facing this. And of course there are particular things as well about this pandemic that are going to affect people differently. And I think we've all been very conscious of the frontline workers who are keeping the place going while all this is happening, people who are who are driving the buses and the trains and getting people to work and helping with those essential services, as well as, of course, our frontline workers. So the general point that I wanted to make by way of introduction was that the impacts of crisis, whether it's a health crisis or the pending climate crisis, are going to affect different groups in our community differently. And I think we have to think about our response to this in different ways. And I also think it's interesting to think about the impact that this is having on Gen Ys, because certainly I've got 3 Gen Y children who are really, in a way, quite shocked by the implications of the economic instability that they're potentially facing for the first time. Of the 3 of those children and their partners, out of the 6 of them, 2 have lost their jobs. One of those was in hospitality and the other was working in the gig economy. So amongst our immediate family, I think that it's been, that kind of pattern has been reflected very broadly. And we've got the privilege and opportunity of being able to look after each other. So of course, those people who face social isolation, lack of connection to community, are going to be really struggling in the face of this. But I wanted to focus, and I hope it was my remit to say, what kind of opportunities might we think about coming out of this crisis, and how does the future potentially look? Now, I'm a kind of hopeless optimist, and I think many of you will just groan at this kind of optimism, but here we go. This is how I'd like to think about it. Of course, this crisis is what we think of as a kind of wicked problem, and many of the problems that we confront, of which climate change is the classic wicked problem, and I want to come back to that point. Other wicked problems such as obesity, traffic congestion, all of, housing unaffordability, all of these kinds of difficult social problems, wicked problems, are problems that have multiple causes, affect people in different ways, different groups. More vulnerable people are affected more directly. But most importantly, what defines a wicked problem is that it's a problem that's not amenable to a straightforward technical solution. In other words, we don't fix traffic congestion by building a new road. If it was that simple, we'd have solved some of these complex problems. So when we think about the COVID-19 crisis, of course, it's been a classic wicked problem. We're waiting for the technological fix of potentially the immunisation or the vaccine, but even if that happens, we know that's not going to be the complete solution. So what characterises wicked problems is that we have to address them fundamentally in three different kinds of ways. There's always a regulatory or a policing response. We have to think about not just a regulatory response, but we have to think about an economic, or sometimes we think about it as a pricing response, but we have to have an economic response. And the third way we have to respond to wicked problems, of course, is behaviour change. We have to do things differently. We're not going to solve traffic congestion, we're not going to solve obesity, and particularly we're not going to solve things like climate change if we don't do things differently, if we don't behave differently. In other words, this kind of response to these changes has to take the community along, has to take people along in terms of the hearts and minds. We have to be able to convince people to do things differently. And so the parallel, of course, that I see between the response to the COVID-19 crisis and climate change is that I'm hoping that we can take some lessons from this and deliver us with some confidence that we can make the kinds of changes as a society needed to address these kinds of complex problems. We've seen the COVID response be classically the wicked problem, where we've not just had to rely on the policing, we get fined if we do the wrong thing. We've had a really significant economic response, of course, but we've also had to do things differently. This virus isn't going, the reason that the curve's flattening, and hopefully that continues, is because we've all had to do things differently. And of course, for many of us, it's been very challenging. Likewise, with the COVID-19 response, we've had to rely very significantly on our experts, medical experts, the medical research community, and expertise is fundamental to guiding the decisions that we make as a society through this process. Now, every day we see the Premier or the Prime Minister standing next to the Chief Health Officer or the Chief Medical Officer, and here is this expertise right in the centre of our discussions, and each day we get new information. Each day we're looking to science and medical science to help us respond to this difficult challenge. So, and the other parallel, of course, with climate change is that we're not only are we going to have to rely on expertise, but we have to be able to take confidence, I think, from the types of behaviour change that we've been able to demonstrate through this crisis. So one of the other, I think, parallels in this discussion is that there has been a false dichotomy drawn between number of people and their lives and the economy, as if whatever strategy we take, we somehow set the dial in a different place. If we let a few old people die, you know, it won't have such serious implications for the economy. Well, of course, that's a false dichotomy. Likewise, the false dichotomy that we regularly hear talked about in terms of climate change, where we're either going to have an economy or we're going to have an environment, as if they're two different things, and whatever we do to try and address climate change is somehow going to ruin the economy. So just by concluding, I think that what we can take for the future out of the COVID-19, with my impossible optimism, is that what we've been able to do really can have some important lessons for us in some of these wicked problems, but particularly I think the parallels with climate change. The same range of strategies are going to be necessary. We're going to have to listen to the experts. We're going to have to stop with the science denial. We're going to have to take that kind of expertise seriously, and we've really got to be able to act in a way that responds to that expertise. But importantly, I think we should have the confidence that we can do things differently. Our behaviour can change, and it can have dramatic impacts on outcomes. And we just as well have to do things differently to address the threat of climate change, particularly really critical things such as consumption. We will have to live differently, we will have to consume differently, we will have to work differently. Many of the things that we've had to confront are dealing with this COVID crisis. So I think it's really important here that we take some comfort from the fact that we have been able to make the changes. I appreciate the context is different. The COVID things come on very quickly. Some people think that the climate change threat is a slow burn. I think that's a conversation we could potentially have afterwards. But from my point of view, I hope that we can recognise the importance of the complexity of some of the problems that we face, understand that we've been pretty successful so far in our response to COVID-19, and that we can take those lessons, and particularly the confidence with our communities that we can do things differently with improved outcomes. So I'm happy to have more conversation about that. I'm
bursting with questions, but I will hold off. I think, as you're saying, we've had a glimpse of a different future in some respects, and that's step one. But how we get there and it affects sustainable change is the real question that I'll want to come back to. Interestingly, I saw a BBC article a few days ago, and I can't find it now for the life of me, but it was a university study, and one of the questions they asked was, what would you like to go back to the old normal? Remarkably, only 9% of respondents said they'd like to go back to the life they had 6 months ago in its entirety, which I think does reflect some dissatisfaction and therefore some opportunity for change in the future. But Brad, I'll ask you to make some comments, and then I will ask some questions to the panel.
Thanks, Matt, and I'd like to begin too by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land that I'm sitting on tonight, the Awabakal people. Pay my respects to elders past, present and future. I'd also like to thank Newcastle Institute for reinventing yourselves and providing us with the opportunity for the conversation tonight. I think I've, in my own organisation, seen a remarkable change in the way in which we deliver services and respond quickly to COVID-19. So I think important discourse like the discourse promoted by Newcastle Institute, it's great to have the opportunity to speak tonight. We have the opportunity though, because to pick up on Father Rod's point, we do sit in a position of privilege. All of us have access to a device, and that device can access the internet. And one of the big issues that we have seen over the last month has been digital exclusion for many of the people that we support, particularly young people and families trying to access school activities, which puts them into disproportionate danger because they have to continue to go to school in order to access that, or they miss out completely. But they're not my opening comments, that's just my response to the words of panelists beforehand. But I'm with Roberta. I believe in impossible optimism, and I think it is beholden on us to remain optimistic about that. My comments are going to reflect on an opinion piece I wrote for the Herald, and some of you may have seen, but it was built on the basis of some words from a podcast author, Dave Hollis, who said, in the rush to return to normal, use this time to consider which parts of normal are worth rushing back to, which picks up on Matt's comments in the BBC article. Those kind of words have been a source of inspiration for me, as Samaritans, like all of us, have adapted to the changes and challenges that COVID-19 has really forced upon us. I think our previous way of living seems like a dream from a long time ago. It's been the longest month I've experienced, I think. I mean, who really thought a month ago that we would experience such large-scale shutdown of society? I mean, who really thought we'd witness these queues of people lining up outside Centrelink offices, that we would be excluded from seeing friends and families? So everything we know, it professionally, personally, has been turned upside down and inside out. People who'd taken their freedom for granted are now grappling with some of those freedoms being taken away. People who have never encountered financial vulnerability are now struggling to pay the bills. And people who previously supported organisations like Samaritans are now seeking support for themselves. We witnessed this briefly in the bushfire period over just before Christmas and into New Year, and I thought that would spark a conversation, not expecting that we'd then be gifted a global pandemic to force people into vulnerability. But we also know that already vulnerable communities are now facing even greater threats. The lockdowns are going to increase, without doubt, the incidence of domestic and family violence. As I mentioned before, the lack of access to technology and broadband is going to exacerbate social isolation and educational disadvantage. And people with disability are at an increased risk of exclusion and illness. Yet, I think, to be what impossible optimist, I've written that down, Roberta, I think that amongst all of that chaos and turmoil, there are some incredible things happening. Governments and their response to the COVID-19 crisis and to stimulate the economy in a period of social distancing are really seeing people set aside the traditional party lines and start to develop solutions that 6 months ago were inconceivable. We are seeing some interesting, strong leadership emerge in the community, and existing weak leadership is being challenged by that. And I think that weak leadership is being laid bare for all to see. And I don't need to mention names there. I think politicians and media identities, particularly those who sought to polarize debate and use that polarization to preserve power, are being forced aside because we now have to find innovative solutions to benefit our community. And I think what I'm pleased to see is that renewed appreciation for the importance of social safety nets, such as income support, community services. I do think that the small and medium businesses, they are the economic powerhouses of our society, and they are bearing the brunt of this downturn. Their importance to our economy is more visible than ever before. And we're seeing the risk of, we've got temporary closure, but the risk of permanent closure. But then we've seen those organisations respond with agility and innovation, turn their tools to new techniques. We've seen distilleries become manufacturers of disinfectant gels. We've seen manufacturing organisations start to produce goods and products in PPE. So I think we need to continue to believe in the small and medium business of Australia and support them. I think also what's been lovely to see at a community service organisation level has been how, despite fear and vulnerability, communities are now looking out for each other. I never thought I'd be saying the word about old-fashioned telephone trees, but they're suddenly back in vogue. We've got letterbox drops in our own community, and they sit alongside technologies like FaceTime and Zoom as people start to reach out and check in with each other. Facebook groups are linking us together, linking the community together. We've got teddy bears in the windows around the community here, trying to brighten the days of young people. And we are getting an increase in people reaching out to us at Samaritans with offers of assistance, both donations, but people just seeking to volunteer to help and to support. So, and just finally, I think at a personal level, we're also learning new things about ourselves, what we value in our government, what we value in our employers, what we value in our families, our own strengths, our own capacity. And I think this, we'll touch on this later, I'm sure we'll start to talk to what do we do, how do we embed some of this change? Because we're clearly at a time of seismic change, politically, economic and socially. So in concluding, I've got three hopes about what I would like to see in redefining our previous way of living and moving forward. My first hope is that we're going to see a fresh perspective on what society means to us, taking that understanding of what it means to be vulnerable at a community level, what it feels like to ask for and receive help, and turning that into action, perhaps even political action. My second hope is that we will use this experience and turn it to guide some of the other challenges, the ones Roberta referred to in our complex challenges. Climate change. How do we support industries and regions like the Hunter through economic transition? How do we increase the visibility and participation of people with disability? How do we deliver reconciliation with Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples? And how do we make sure that women and children are safe in their own homes? And finally, my hope is that when we reflect on the fear, the uncertainty, and the deep sadness of this time, we're going to find the strength to use this to create a positive legacy for us as individuals and us as a community.
Thanks, Brad. And I think the question I want to kick off with, I hope I'm not pouring water on that hope that you've very well articulated, which I share. I think I'll badge myself as the impossible optimist as well. But to the extent of government response, what if the response we've seen has been executing a plan to save an economy, but ultimately ideology will drive policy once we're put through the crisis? I think we saw perhaps potentially a sign of this with the finance minister talking about lowering taxes to drive economic growth post-COVID, whereas many would probably advocate for quite the opposite, that we need to actually rebuild public institutions and fund the things that have been shown as shortcomings in society. Hope that we've had this glimpse of hope and future possibilities that many are embracing in different ways. And the environmental ones for me personally are very encouraging, but how do we take that to sustainable change rather than it just being a glimpse of a potential future and one that's dealt with as an incident rather than a change of direction? Anybody on the panel want to try and tackle that one?
I'm happy to kick off, Matt, because I think it depends on, from my perspective, on how are we going to see a shift in political ideology, or how we frame that question. I'm not confident that we're going to see political stripes change overnight. There's not going to be some revelation that suddenly those that had a particular ideological bent are going to change. What I think we will see a change, what I hope we'll see a change with, is in the community's response to that. And that we might have from this opportunity the chance to activate people to become more politically active, to then get involved. You know, we have a whole mass of people, and again, we talked about that earlier in regard to the industries affected here. Young people in hospitality, young people in retail, who are suddenly now going, gosh, the cushy life I was leading is actually is a bit flimsy. What am I going to do about that? And if that translates into action for them at the ballot box, into them asking the questions, the ideology will be about bringing in new political leadership. And so I think it's how you frame the question. Are we going to change those that have got embedded ideologies? I'm not sure. I think they're executing a plan that's rational and the right plan. What I hope for is we see an activation of our community becoming more politically active.
Mm-hmm. Would you agree with that, Roberta?
Oh, look, I really would. I think there's a couple of potentially concrete ways we might see some differences. I think the job keeper and the changes to the job keeper and particularly the job seeker allowance, I hope that this is a fundamental recognition that the previous level that the unemployment benefit was set at is not something you can live on. And I hope it's really difficult for any government to take it back to that level, and of course we need to keep increasing it from here. I also hope that I think there are choices that we make around the strategies that we use, and I find it very disappointing to hear the government talking about tax relief for the rich as a way to stimulate the economy. Of course, we need to be getting money into the hands of people in the lower income brackets, and we need to be getting that money into their hands directly. And I think even if you compared the Labor response to the GFC and the coalition response the COVID crisis in economic terms, broadly speaking, much of the money has been put into the hands of business. Hopefully, we hope it all works on the first week of May, that much of that money transfers to the people who've lost their jobs or are working shorter hours. But certainly a Labor government, I think, wouldn't have done that. I think a Labor government would have put much of that money directly into the hands of people, particularly in lower income groups. But I do think what would be, so maybe it has the same effect, maybe it's just as effective, maybe this way is more effective, I'm not sure, but I think they are different. There's different drivers to those kinds of responses politically. I think the other one, and this is really impossible optimism, is that I'd hope that we can have a conversation about taxation. I mean, we really, and Matt, it was in your question, these kinds of pressures that we face under pandemics or under crisis, and we'll feel them under climate change that increasingly takes effect. What it does is it challenges our institutional strength. Now, what we see in America particularly, I think, is that those institutions are very weak. You pay a price for not supporting science to find the vaccines. The fact that those programs were defunded under a previous government means that we're not ready now. That's an institutional weakness. Health and education are incredibly important. Now, to have those services and to have that kind of institutional robustness at the level that we absolutely want them in Australia, I have plenty of research that demonstrates this, we have to pay more taxes. And it's partly about redistribution. It's significantly about redistribution. Rich people have to pay more tax, but we all have to pay more taxes. And I'm hoping that this can be the start of a taxation debate, because we need to recognise how important this framework is for a healthy and fair society. And we're going to pay more taxes if we want it. And we can see the cost of this so vividly in what's happened in other countries and the impact particularly on the vulnerable. So I hope that is really a lesson that we can take out of this.
Mm. Yeah, but that means the population puts a price on what they're seeing in terms of recognising vulnerability and not tolerating that inequity as much anymore. Long gone are the days of franking credits over reform.
I don't think we'll have that conversation this time around here.
But it still seems like quite a quantum leap, and I'm not without hope that we're prepared to pay that price as a society. But Rod, did you have anything on this particular topic of how does this change actually manifest?
And things were already changing, I think. Now, this crisis will really heighten the focus of that change and make it more immediate. But the capitalism, as we know it, grew on the abundance of cheap energy, and clearly that's coming to an end. That's why, I guess, some people who have benefited so much from that system are among the climate change deniers, because it is that cheap, abundant energy that underpins the system that they benefit from so clearly. So the decline, or at least the evolutionary shift in capitalism, will inevitably come with the shift in the availability of abundant cheap energy. So that change is starting to happen. It's how it's managed, how it evolves into a more ecologically focused framework is going to be the question we're beginning to engage with anyway. But this is a shock to capitalism as we know it. And it was already teetering on the brink after the GFC, and we patched it up and tried to make it normal again. But clearly this has revealed how the lack of robust structure in that system has been. This little tiny microscopic virus has come along and completely challenged that system. So here's an opportunity to really rethink that. And I think that was already happening, but economists are really starting to move away from some of those traditional late 19th, early 20th century economic philosophies into something new, and that's great. I agree with Roberta that part of the core of that change will be a more progressive taxation system. as we really do have to engage in some total shift in philosophies of taxation. Now is the time to do this coming political cycle. We'll never have this opportunity again as clearly as we have at this time.
That's true.
And so it's time really for the people to take responsibility of this in our democratic political system, and say, we need it. It's time for the more progressive political parties to ride that wave into tax reform. Thirdly, one of the things we really do need to address is how we understand debt and what we do with it, especially generational debt. And so rather than capitalise it, which we've done in our system to our detriment in the GFC, we seriously have to come to a totally different ideological understanding of what debt does and how we deal with it. They're all positive things. I guess if I had a cautionary, even a negative concern about all that, is that we can see the tabloid media already moving against some of these. We've seen this week the tabloid media in Victoria move against Daniel Andrews, and he's done an extraordinary job in Victoria. We've seen it even in some ways move against Gladys Berejiklian in New South Wales, and so that tabloid media who are the tool of the, I guess, the neoconservatives who benefit from the previous incarnation of capitalism that's dying. All the forces of that will move against progressive politics, progressive taxation reform, evolution of the capitalist system, and so that is something if we don't address that somehow or other, we will go back to the old way.
Thanks, Rod. And we now have about 60 or so online, and quite a few questions starting to come through. So I might take some questions from attendees, and please, just to recap, you're welcome to post your questions through the Q&A. You can use the chat if you're on Zoom as well. If you're on Facebook, please just comment your questions, and we'll work through those. So there's a question from Marnie regarding climate change, and certainly it's something I reflected on in terms of if I'd said to world leaders in January, I'd like to do an experiment and just stop the world for a month and see what happens. I don't think it would have gone far, but the extent to which the world has healed itself already is quite incredible. So where to from here in respect of climate change after this proof of concept we've seen in terms of clearing skies and clearing waters and the resurgence of nature in many respects. Roberta, I might put this to you initially. I know you're passionate about this topic.
Yeah, look, I do think it's one of the key opportunities that's come out of this, and I do think the real challenge in climate change, of course, is that we have to do things differently. Each of us have to live our lives differently. We have to value different things. We have to behave differently towards each other and towards the planet. And fundamentally, it means we have to consume less. And of course, that's a extraordinarily challenging concept for the economists or for the economy, or of course the principal economic notions that you don't have to confront the division of the pie, the metaphorical economic pie, if it continues to grow. The fundamentals of modern economics, of course. So what climate change means is we have to confront a diminishing pie, and what that really means is we have to confront redistribution. These are extremely significant and difficult questions. We have to tax rich people more. We have to do things like introduce inheritance taxes. My goodness, all these rather old-fashioned and quaint notions. But I do think that the key for us here in this is that we can behave differently. We can change our behaviours. And I'm hoping the practice of spending less, doing less, whilst it's putting a lot of our friends and colleagues out of work and our children, it leads us to the importance of much more robust economies, much more resilient economies, much more resilient kinds of work. But fundamentally, I hope that this exercise, and it's going to go on for months more, of course, it will show us that we can actually do this in a way that will protect our planet. So I reckon that's the great lesson out of the COVID experience, is that people are doing this, they're in hearts and minds. We're all behaving differently, and it's not just having a positive impact on our planet, it's also having a positive impact on, I think, the way we value relationships. And, you know, we're all living without the takeaway coffees, or at least I am. And look, you know, here we are, still alive to talk about it today. So I'm hoping that it's the practice of changing the behaviour that we can really get confident around.
And hopefully we can recognise a creeping crisis as well as we can recognise something
the one that
we woke up to.
smacked us in the mouth. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. I'll go to Q&A, catch these questions as they're coming through. Question from Fergus. Thanks, Fergus. Is growing equality the defining economic and social issue of our time? That's a big, bold question. What's the view of the panel? Inequality as a defining economic and social issue.
I'll just do it quickly. Yeah, the answer from me would be yes, of course, but you just have to look at my background. I've been banging on about this for years. Yes, I think the answer to that's yes.
Maybe that's something that sort of sums up what we are living through, and the almost the revelation that's coming through for many people, and redefining vulnerability and seeing firsthand what inequity actually looks like in societies, far less abstract for many as it might have been only just a few months ago. Just to go reading another question here, quite a long question from Sam Reich, that Sam explains he's part of a coalition of advocates seeking increased active travel, and launching a campaign to encourage councils to respond to the challenge of COVID-19 isolation and lockdowns by facilitating changing roads and streets to be safer, healthier, with increased space, etc. Sam's group would like to see increased participation and reliance on these forms of transport being encouraged by councils, and to provide more room for health and safety. So I think that's a great example of something that we've already seen, a huge increase in cycling in many cities in the early stage of the epidemic. I think in New York, when the subway fell 70%, cycling was up 65% correspondingly, and hopefully that becomes a habit for some longer term. But I think that's a great sort of observation where a potential positive change has been identified, and leads to what should be a planning decision, I guess, in a local sense. So Sam, I think that's almost an obvious, it's a productive effort, and certainly one I'd support. But goes to that question of how do you make these changes manifest in the long term sustainably? But thanks for the question, Sam. I have another question coming through here. This is in relation to, I know we've sort of covered that one, sorry. I'll just move on to the next question.
Can I just jump back to Fergus's question about inequality? Because like Roberta, I certainly too believe inequality is a major issue. But I think, like, is it the defining economic and social issue of our time? Is climate change? I don't think it's a competition. I think what it is a symptomatic and a reflection of the very things we've been talking about around the rich getting richer, that growing inequality, the lack of progressive taxation systems, the way in which the media influences the conversations. I think we've got to tackle some of the kind of that underlying systemic stuff, which will address some of those issues that are symptomatic of that, like climate change, like inequality.
Mm-hmm.
I'll jump in on that too, Brad. I mean, inequality is the symptom of the idea of infinite growth. If you have this idea of infinite growth, then some parts of the economy and some participants in the economy will grow quicker than others, and therefore the gap will continue to widen. We're in a biological crisis at the moment, and when we look at infinite growth from a biological perspective, we call it cancer. And so that's actually exactly what's happening in our society. when we look about that sort of concept of infinite growth. So part of the way to address that, that widening gap is to look at what parts of our economy, what sectors of the economy need to continue to grow, and what sectors of the economy need to, in a sense, radically degrow in that sense. And until we start to look at, to shift our focus from sort of that aggregate GDP thing of growth to a more differentiated understanding of that, we will continue to get that widening.
Mm. Yeah. Yeah, certainly. It's a breathtaking time to live through. You reflect on what we're witnessing and what's yet to come. I've just realised too, we're running very close to the end of the session already. It's flown past. And I was going to ask you for some closing comments. I might go to Roberta to just make a few comments, noting, yeah, we're almost at 8 o'clock. So I'm sure we could talk for another hour if we so wished, but we won't. So Roberta, could I just ask you to close off from your perspective?
Yeah, thanks very much, Matt. It's a terrifically interesting conversation. It'd be great to continue it. I think just in a practical sense, one of the implications of the inequality that plays itself out as we think of some of the transmission sources of the virus have been people who are casual workers and who I'm expecting would have either ignored symptoms or continued to work because they absolutely had to. And this is just a practical implication of when we don't have robust labour markets, when we don't have good safety nets for people will take risks that have implications for themselves, for their immediate family and their workmates. And this is just one of the ordinary, if you like, implications of structural inequality, where we see example after example from the transmission of the virus. But we could generate those kinds of examples in all sorts of other contexts. So it's been great to talk to everybody.
Thanks, Roberta. Brad, any last thoughts before we sign off?
I feel like we're just starting to get some momentum because I think
yes, I agree.
Interesting things to unpack here. There are a couple of things I'd like to come back to. One is the comment about the respect for science. One of the things I would like to see, and I've been banging on about this since I learned all about it at HMRI, around evidence-based practice. How do we get back to a point where we actually listen to what science and research tells us about policy, about what we need to do in our community, and actually have robust public debates around evidence, around science, and use that to influence policy rather than ideology. Now that's my super hopeful, impossible optimism coming forth. But I think what we've seen is in the response to COVID is some semblance of accepting the science and responding to the science. And for the epidemiologists and public health people, a big shout out, because they're finally being heard and acknowledged for the science that they bring to the conversation. So, yeah, just we could continue to talk, but I would like to, that comment about science, coming back to respecting evidence and using that to drive public policy.
It's certainly refreshing. We haven't had the sort of scientific or anti-science debate that was, even during the bushfire season, seemed to be fairly prevalent and confounding for many, I guess. And thank goodness we haven't had a repeat of that more recently. Rod, there's actually a question here. I don't think you may not be able to answer it, but I'm asked by Bert to check what will be the sign-on Gosford Church next week. Now, I'd say he may have a wager going there, so you may.
I can't possibly reveal that because I don't know. But at the moment, it says let's not get back to normal because normal wasn't working.
Oh, great. Yeah, that's a very famous sign, certainly. And Rod, whilst you're speaking, any closing comments or thoughts from yourself?
Yeah, I mean, I think we have seen a real shift to the extreme end of, I guess, shareholder ideologies around profit. It has to be about profit, and sort of all economic activity has to be about profit. And we've gone to such an extreme end of that. So I hope in this process that we might end up, nothing wrong with profit. We actually need profit, which, you know, takes us forward economically. But to have economic activity that's actually driven by meaning as well as profit, I think is a goal that we ought to strive for.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I don't think too many will disagree with that sentiment. We could continue for a while, but there's no further questions, and I do have a few other announcements, so I might take the opportunity now to thank all of the panelists for joining us this evening for the webinar. I think it's not only given, it's given us a chance to reflect on a degree of disenchantment with what was normal before, and therefore see opportunities and have hope for a different looking society when the pandemic is over. And I think that's a fantastic silver lining and a message of hope in what are very dark times for many people. Just to outline the next 3 webinars for members, on the 13th of May, maintaining democracy during the pandemic. We have a panel assembled which will be including John Hewson AM, the former leader of the Liberal Party. On June 10th, the future is not what it was, the economy and the world of work, with a panel including Alison Pennington Senior, Economist, Centre for the Future of Work at the Australia Institute, Angela Jackson, economist at Equity Economics, and Professor Will Rifkin, Chair in Applied Regional Economics at Newcastle University and the HRF Centre at University of Newcastle. On July 8th, we will have an opportunity to consider a different approach to mental health with Professor Pat Gorry AM. Professor Patrick McGorry is the Executive Director of Origin, Professor of Youth Mental Health at the University of Melbourne, and the Founding Director of the National Youth Mental Health Foundation. We will send details out about these events closer to the dates, but certainly hope you can join us again. And thanks for your attendance tonight. Thank you all.
Thank you.